on Pinzone Island. It's a smaller island in the Galapagos, but in 2012, rats were eradicated there. So the island still had Pinzone tortoises, but all the Pinzone tortoises were basically there because of really active management of collecting eggs, of taking them to the Galapagos National Park, incubating them, rearing them to a certain size when the rats wouldn't bother them, and letting them go. The year after rats were eradicated was the first recording of tortoise hatchlings emerging from burrows, eggs laid there, hatched there, coming out in 150 years.
Wow.
So, 1 year and this huge milestone happens. And after that, a few years later, Pinzone tortoises went from listed by the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, extinct in the wild to vulnerable, and that's
so weird.
That's skipping past the rankings of critically endangered and endangered.
Hey folks, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Christoph, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Now, invasive species. We all kind of know what that is. You've heard that term before. Something is here that you don't want it to be here. What do we do about it? Well, today, we're speaking to a couple of folks who do invasive species eradication on the regular. And one of them is Wes Jolley. He is a project manager for island conservation. Now, island conservation's mission is to prevent extinctions by removing invasive species from islands. And the other person we're talking to is Dena Spatz. Dena Spatz is a senior conservation scientist at Pacific Rim Conservation. Pacific Rim's mission is to maintain and restore native bird diversity, populations, and ecosystems in Hawaii and the Pacific region. So same kind of thing. And I wanted to bring them both on to talk about invasives, to talk about invasive eradication. What is an invasive species exactly? How do we define that versus a introduced species? How do we go about establishing that an invasive species is a problem? How do we go about getting people on board with eliminating an invasive species? What is the public outreach? How does that work? What are the responses once you do eradicate something? How does the ecology respond? How does the economy respond? How does the local culture respond? And then finally, we get into some ideas about attacking invasive species on the mainland. And so the reason of talking about islands is because, well, first of all, Wes and Dena work with islands, but also there's so many examples. I can't remember the paper that they released that Dena headed, if it had hundreds or thousands of examples of invasive species eradication on islands, but there was a lot. And so we're here to talk about that paper and to give some insight into the topic of invasive species. So yeah, sponsors for this episode. Wes Fraser is the number one sponsor for 2022. Thank you, Wes Fraser. Without you, this would not be possible. And secondly, Greenlink Forestry has been with me since the beginning, and I cannot thank them enough for their support. Again, wouldn't be possible without them. And without any further messing around, let's dive into this conversation all about invasive species eradication and what that means for our world. Here we go. Dena, why don't we start with you? Can you just give us a quick rundown on your story and what is it about this work that's driving your passion? Why are you here, right?
Yeah, thanks for having me on the podcast. My name is Dena Spatz. I'm a senior conservation scientist at a nonprofit called Pacific Rim Conservation. They're based in Hawaii. I'm actually in California. Okay. And their mission is really to restore bird populations in the Hawaiian Islands and across the Pacific generally. And that kind of but to do that, it kind of requires the removal or control of invasive species from those islands. And we will talk more about that later. But my trajectory to there was not really necessarily direct. When I was in college, I went to UC Santa Cruz. I was an environmental studies and anthropology double major. So I had this interest in environmental studies and people and human, nature interactions. But it wasn't until my senior year, I took this bird class. And I should have taken it earlier in my college career because it completely opened up kind of my passion. I had no idea that I would be so interested in birds until I had this amazing professor. And so when I graduated, I was kind of like, okay, I have a lot of interests. I'm not sure where to go with them. And so he said, hey, I actually teach this research apprenticeship course up in the San Juan Islands at Friday Harbor Labs, which is the Marine Labs for University of Washington. He said, it's a free program. Why don't you come up there and, see what you discover? So I said, okay, that works. So I went there, and the apprenticeship was actually called the Pelagic Ecosystem Function Research Apprenticeship. And so they basically, a total mouthful. And I didn't even really understand.
I don't know what that word is even.
I didn't know what that meant. I'm like, okay, I'll do it. Sure. I'll figure it out when I get there. Right. So it basically what it was they threw a bunch of recent graduate, from undergraduate onto boats. And we learned all about the, nearshore marine ecosystem off of the San Juan Islands. So we were on research vessels. We did oceanography. We collected plankton. We looked at fish. And then we also looked, at the top of the ecosystem, which were the marine mammals and birds that were in that system. And there was just this, I remember this one day I was on, doing a bird survey, a seabird survey off the bow of the boat. And I saw these teeny little birds flying in a row. They were skimming right above the water. They're about the size of your hand. They're called ancient merlets. And all of a sudden, there was maybe 5 of them in a row. They just dove right into the water. I could still see them from the boat. So at this point now, they're swimming, but they're keeping up at the same speed, and then they fly right out. And I was like, wow, okay, that was incredible. How did they do that? So I focused my time there really watching more seabirds and foraging and doing what they do. And through that process, I fell in love with that group of birds, with seabirds. So when I was finished, I took a couple jobs in, seabird work, field work, that kind of thing. I really dove into learning more about them. And as I did, I realized, as you do with really anything you get into studying, is you start learning about their conservation status. And I learned that seabirds are actually the most threatened bird group on the planet. There's 30% of all seabirds are threatened with extinction. Something like 170 million individual seabirds are impacted by at least one threat. It's insane. And so, I wanted to go back to grad school to work on seabird conservation, become a conservation scientist. And so that's where I actually went back to UC Santa Cruz, but in the ecology department this time, with Don Kroll and Bernie Tershi. And they actually founded Island Conservation, where Wes works. And so they introduced me to islands, because that's where seabirds mostly breed, and also to the issues of really invasive species on islands, because they are the major driver of extinction in those areas, and specifically for seabirds. So right when I started grad school, they actually said, hey, I have this volunteer opportunity on this island called Desecheo, which is an island off of Puerto Rico, National Wildlife Refuge, to monitor species out there. So I'm like, okay, yeah, sure. So they sent me out to this island with Island Conservation because they were planning a rat eradication. And I had read all about this island, how there were clouds of seabirds that once, flew all across this island, but over time they disappeared. There were species that had been introduced to the island. And so we were there to see, what was going on. And it was really unexpected for me that there were no seabirds there at all, zero. I think there were a couple individuals on an offshore rock hanging out, but nothing else. And it was just kind of quiet. And there were rats all in our camps. They were everywhere. And so I was like, okay, I'm convinced this is a big problem. Right. So, I focused my grad work on actually working with island conservation and other nonprofits to think about where there are threatened species on islands, where there are invasive species, and where there are areas where we can work to prevent extinctions, essentially. From there, I worked for Island Conservation for a while. I did some more biodiversity monitoring, but also did more kind of data science projects. And now I'm at Pacific Rim Conservation, where I focus more sort of on what happens after you remove invasive species, so the restoration aspect of that. But yeah, that was my general trajectory to where I am now.
Very cool. No, you painted some excellent pictures there, especially the birds diving into the water, right? Like that's a good way to get people to just imagine what the kind of thing we're talking about. Like I could just imagine it myself. I don't know what these birds look like, but I can guess. That was awesome. Thank you. Appreciate that. Wes, your turn. What's your story? Why are you here? What drives you? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Thanks for the chance to be here and share a little bit today. So, yeah, my name's Wes Jolley. I work for Island Conservation, as Dena mentioned. We're a nonprofit centered out of Santa Cruz, California, that our mission is to prevent extinctions by removing invasive species from islands. I don't live in Santa Cruz. I live in Salem, Oregon. I am the head of operations for our United States program. So that basically means that I manage our program, our suite of projects we have going in the US, which ranges from Puerto Rico to Hawaii to US Pacific territories like American Samoa. I've been working at IC for 13 years now. And I really consider my expertise a bit more on the project side of things. So, how do we go from an idea of doing this project to getting the pieces together, getting the funding, getting the schedule, making sure we really understand what it's going to take to do the project, what it's going to take to manage the risks effectively, all the things like that.
Yeah.
I got into islands a bit by accident, really, a lot of really fortunate accidents. I studied wildlife biology at Utah State University, and through that, really came into the field a bit more of land management, predator management. After I graduated, if I can go back a second,
yeah, whatever.
So, sorry,
it's your show right now. It's all good.
Yeah. So while I was in school, I was my first sort of introduction to working on islands. I did a summer position on the barrier islands of Virginia, and we were trapping raccoons, which weren't really invasive, but they had got there on their own. Most likely that was part of the study, looking at how they're moving around chains, how they're moving around islands. So that was my sort of first exposure to working on islands, we were doing some seabird surveys in that, but also doing predator surveys, looking for tracks on the beach, putting out track pads, really understanding, starting to connect what the potential impacts of the presence of these animals on the islands is. Right. After I graduated, I worked on islands. It wasn't island-focused ecology, but I did a couple seasons in Southeast Alaska working for the Forest Service. The first year I was on a silviculture team, so we were flying out to remote islands and going to old previous logging stands, and it was really prioritizing sort of thinning and restoration efforts for contracts that the Forest Service would put out to sort of manage the forest there. And then I did a year on more of a timber crew. We were doing some lining out potential timber sales, doing some helping with some timber cruising, things like that. And that really sparked my love and interest of like, hey, it's possible to get to these really amazing places as part of your job. Like places you didn't, that was the real start of starting to click of like, I'm actually in places that I never really thought I would be or could be, and opening up the idea of like, hey, there's a big world out there, and a lot of interesting things. Then I took a little bit of a hiatus. I was a bartender for a year because my wife, we moved to Pennsylvania so she could do a internship to get her dietetics license, things like that. So I was just sort of wrapping that period up. She was getting done and starting to look at what was next for us. We were kind of hitting that phase where we wanted to look at careers or going back to school or whatever. And again, just really fortunate. A good friend from college had started working for Island Conservation. And I had, talked to him a little bit about it. He had gone down to an island called Isla de la Plata in Ecuador. and had some really amazing stories. He was, I think at that point, getting ready to go out to Desecheo that Dena mentioned early, where to work on some of the invasive species removal efforts there. And they needed another teammate to come out. And the main focus was the team was going to be working on San Nicolas Island. So that's an island off the coast of Southern California, part of the California Channel Islands. Okay. So put in my application, did everything I could, got hired, and really started working in the field. And that was a project to remove cats to protect seabirds. And so again, I was coming at it as sort of the, I'm here to do the on the ground action, remove the invasive species, came at it from that. Honestly, wasn't super interested in things like seabirds. I mean, I thought they were cool, but I didn't consider myself a birder. I kind of was maybe thinking I needed to be a little more macho or something. But
there's always that ego in there, especially for us dudes.
Especially, a bunch of young people out on an island by themselves. Kind of all of our first, quote unquote, real job.
I can't like this pretty bird. I'm a guy.
Yeah. But we didn't want to appreciate it. But on that island, actually, there's a small species of fox called the Channel Island fox, and we were focused on removing the invasive cats, but there is a lot more of these little foxes there, and so we interacted with them a lot, and they exhibit a kind of classic island species trait, which is they didn't come about, or their life history doesn't typically involve predators. And
right.
Just for a note, the cats weren't really directly predating. That wasn't necessarily the interaction or what we were there for. But so these foxes were super calm, and we just hung out, and we're much more just like much more not like a wild animal as we picture it that scurries away. That you might be driving and they'd walk out in the middle of the road with their kits and just like hang out and sit there, and you get out of the car and look at them and they don't really care. And it was just an amazing connection with nature. And again, a real moment of like, when I was in school, we heard about, species on islands being naive to predators and not really reacting to people, and then seeing it and making that connection, but also, gotcha. Seeing those, and seeing bird species, land bird species similarly that just acted really different than you might see on the mainland. But also that really just sinks in that how vulnerable islands can be when invasive predator comes out or an invasive species is introduced, the balance that is there and how much it could be disrupted by something coming out. Invasive species cause a lot of problems worldwide, of course, but on islands, really seeing that impact can be magnified just by the very nature of the life history of these island species.
Yeah. No, that totally makes sense. Yeah, I never thought about the naivety of like predators on islands, and they got nothing to worry about, so they're just like living the free life. Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks to both of you. Those are both excellent introductions. Nice. You're painting a picture. I like it. We got right into I feel myself got right into the world that you guys were living. So thank you. So yeah, let's dive into this conversation. We're here to talk about invasives and invasives on islands, and before we get too deep into it, let's just start with the basics, right? Let's start with like a definition. Like, what is an invasive species? And then from there, we can get into like, first of all, how do they get to islands? Why is that such a problem? And this and that and the other thing. So, Dena, do you maybe want to start, give a little definition and maybe answer some of the questions about how these animals get there and why it's such an issue?
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, I can start with a general definition because we use the word invasive species a lot. But what's important to know is what we're talking about is a non-native species that has or a species that has been introduced outside of its native range is a non-native species. But what an invasive species is something that causes harm. So an organism of any kind that's been introduced outside of its native range that causes harm to that incipient ecosystem or whatever else is around it also it can cause problems to people. So that's where our definition of invasive species is, because there are a lot of, introduced non-native species all over the world, and they don't necessarily cause harm. So I think that's just like an important baseline to know that that's what we are thinking about, is the stuff that we know does cause harm. But taking a huge step back about, islands and invasive species, and even further back, is just that, at this point, most people know that we're losing biodiversity, across our planet at unprecedented rates. But what is maybe not as well known is that is actually happening faster on islands than anywhere else. Biodiversity is actually concentrated on islands. About 20% of all known species are from islands, and islands only represent about 5% of global land mass. So there's a disproportionate amount of species richness already on islands.
Right.
And the reason for that is, you think of an island as a piece of land surrounded by water. It's a pretty simple definition, but that is a geographic barrier to so many different kinds of organisms. So for a long time, islands, there's offshore islands, that arose from volcanoes like Hawaii. There's nearshore islands that, like the Channel Islands off the coast of California, that once were actually connected to land. And then now the oceans are higher, and so now they're islands. So they've come about in different kinds of ways. But so the things that can get to islands, or the things that survive on islands, it takes a special kind of critter to even get out there. Like think about, Hawaii. How did anything get out there in the first place, right? Yeah. So it's usually, we're seeing animals transported by wind, like spiders. Birds obviously can fly, but being able to fly that far is quite difficult. So it's usually storms and other things that are pushing animals across the ocean that happen to land on these islands. And once they get there, because there's not much else there, there's opportunity to, find their own niche and stay. And that's what we saw in Hawaii. There was a species of finch that probably blew in from Asia and radiated into 50 different species that are called Hawaiian honey creepers. Many of them are now extinct, and we can talk about that in a minute. But that is sort of an example of just how, some creatures can get out there. They have to be able to survive. And then over time, they kind of evolve into being their own thing. On the Channel Islands, there was actually a pygmy mammoth. So mammoths were using the Channel Islands, but once they got cut off, they were geographically separated from the continent. And so there we see these amazing adaptations of animals. They kind of get big, or they get small, or they have, one thing that happens to a lot of island species is they lose their defensive strategies. And Wes was talking about this quite a bit. Predation is not as common on islands, or at least we don't normally see things like cats on islands. I mean, imagine your house cat swimming out to Hawaii, or even, rafting out there on it just wouldn't happen. So a lot of animals just evolved to not have predators like that, or at least have a kind of a more, competitive predation environment. So they over time lost a lot of the defenses. And that's why, you hear about Darwin's finches in the Galapagos. They'll just fly right up to you. Or like Wes talked about the island fox, it just comes right up to you because does not have that instinct. Same with seabirds, like albatross, they just nest out in the open, and you can walk right up to an albatross and it wouldn't even bat an eye at you. And that
I didn't know that.
Strange. Oh yeah. It's the most bizarre thing. So islands are like these hot spots for just incredible diversity, incredibly unique species, and endemism is what we call for anything found, in one place and nowhere else. So, islands are hotspots of endemism for all these reasons. But it's also for these reasons that islands are epicenters of extinction. So over 60% of all of the world's extinctions since the 1500s has occurred on islands. About 40% of globally threatened vertebrates are from islands. So they're hotspots of extinction. They're hotspots for where threatened species are. And we found that the primary driver of this threat is invasive species that have been brought to islands either intentionally or unintentionally by people specifically, and that have caused horrible damage to island communities. So, I mean, invasive species are not specific to islands, right? On the mainland, there's zebra mussels that came in from ship ballast into the Great Lakes and they came from Asia, and now they're in the US and Canada and are clogging, water systems and covering up piers. There's a lot of examples of invasive species all over the world, but they have the damage that happens on islands is far worse and it happens so quickly because the species there are just not used to having predators, or in some cases herbivores. And so, yeah, you see, for example, I talked about Desecheo Island off the coast of Puerto Rico. The seabirds there, they could not compete with the fact that there were rats introduced to the island. Rats are omnivores. They eat birds, bird eggs, they eat seeds. So you see changes in forests, you see changes in bird communities, you see changes just across entire ecosystems there. Mm-hmm. And I think we'll probably get into like giving a lot more examples of where this is happening. But
I think so.
yeah. And sharing some island stories, which is so fun. But because islands are insular places, we can actually also remove invasive species from islands. And so that's an important take home too, that there's this huge problem, but there's also this huge opportunity to reverse that problem.
Yeah. The first thing that comes to my mind when you were talking there was it's almost like islands are canary in a coal mine for the rest of the world, right? They're kind of that alarm system for like, hey, this is what's happening here. Guess what's happening everywhere else after that, right? So that was my first kind of clue in there to the importance of monitoring islands and doing what we can there, because it's just a matter of time, right? And like you said, like because of the size, obviously I'm sure all the niches are taken up, and there's a lot more easily for everything to fall apart than on the mainland. But ultimately, I guess at the same time, the same rules apply to mainland places, just at a larger scale, right?
Exactly.
And as far as stories go, I think the first time I was introduced to the concept of island conservation with invasive species, I think it was The Song of the Dodo. Do you guys know that book? Probably, right? That was, I think we all had to read that in school. I think it was that book where they were talking about the goat. There was a goat problem, I think, and they're trying to eradicate goats to try and bring back Galapagos tortoises or something like that. And that was like and I was like, what do you mean goats and tortoises? Like, what the hell does that have to do? And it was this big, I can't even give the example. I just remember that there was a goat problem on the Galapagos. They got rid of the goats with like Judas goats and stuff and basically just shot them all. And then all of a sudden, all these species, not just tortoises, but that was the focus because they're these incredible creature. But yeah, I thought it was like my first introduction to understanding that concept of an invasive species in a real detrimental, not like a dandelion way or something like that, right?
Yeah. And the Galapagos is an amazing example of all these issues, because we think about it as these pristine islands, where so much of our knowledge of ecology was, founded there by Darwin. I was talking about Darwin's finches. But yeah, invasive species were introduced to a lot of those islands, goats included. Rats were a major issue and preying on hatchlings of tortoises. So yeah, that example is pretty profound. I think a lot of people don't realize how much damage has happened from invasive species in that area. But there's a lot of work that's being done to reverse that.
Yeah. So how do these, like you mentioned early on, like pre-people traveling the oceans and that kind of thing, that it was wind and blowing stuff in and birds dropping stuff off. How much worse did invasives become? Like, do we have an understanding of that once people started really traveling all over the place?
Yeah. So one reason why goats are in the Galapagos at all and on random offshore islands is because when, explorers and also whalers, people that came around for seal hunting, otter hunting, they came and found these islands that had these amazing, populations of marine mammals that they could hunt. But there was nothing else for them to eat on these islands. And so folks like intentionally went from island to island, dropped off goats as like a food security source for them so they could come back another time. So you find these now this activity is not really happening, but those goats are still there and they are fundamentally changing, the plant ecosystem, forests. And that also impacts, birds, seabirds, tortoises, all the things you can imagine.
Right. Go ahead, Wes. I can see you want to say something.
It's just really making me think about we often as scientists and focusing on seabird recovery and the ecological benefits of this, we can overlook how much this is the human element of these, and it definitely applies. to islands as well. So islands they're home to about 11% of the world's population, and 27% of the world's languages are from people spoken on islands. And invasive species have huge. So that, it's a huge portion of the population that is also seeing these more pronounced effects from invasive species on islands. And similar to what you were saying earlier about them being sort of the canary in the coal mine, from a human perspective, that's very much true. The invasive species impacts can be really pronounced on food systems, on livelihoods. Invasive species on land can have detrimental effects on reefs, on fisheries, which we can talk more about later. Other problems like climate change are felt on islands. So it really is connected to all of us in that way. And, I think it also ties into that, very human element, as Dena was saying, the definition of an invasive species as a species that caused harm. Those first people exploring the Galapagos put in goats, they weren't causing harm. They were keeping them alive. Right. And so, right. It's very dynamic and an evolving definition, and something that is really exciting because you're always learning more and learning the nuance, and what is causing a problem in one place might not be, might be just what we call introduced in another place and not causing so much of a problem. So there can be a lot of room for discussion and thinking about, what really is going on, and what are the true impacts of invasive species and benefits of their removal.
That's an interesting point, that like what's invasive somewhere might just be, like you said, introduced and not really as much of a problem on another island that you would expect to be similar. Yeah, that's interesting. I imagine that's probably takes some time to get around when you're an island conservationist and you're jumping from island to island doing these things, and you have these preconceived notions about species and the problems they can create, and probably takes time to orient yourself to that specific area, right? That's interesting. Yeah, it's all about the nuance in this field, isn't it? Yeah, it takes a long time. So, okay, why is it that invasives are the number one thing that, when it comes to island conservation and invasive species on there, why is eradication of invasive species, why does that work so well?
Yeah, well, I mean, Dena set it up really well with what the problem is. And so, with a very well-defined problem, and then the truth is we have on islands, on a contained system, we have the opportunity to make a holistic solution. So the organization I work for, again, Island Conservation, we were started in the mid-90s by two professors from UC Santa Cruz, some of which I know Dena knows very well, who were working on islands in Mexico, studying seabirds and just seeing the impacts of black rats that were invasive there and predating the seabirds. And basically they, weren't the first to do this work. This work was done, as we can see in Dena's paper, had been started well before that, but was really at a point where it was a proven tool. We had the tools, we had the methods, and the results were clear that you could remove an invasive species. We often say a one-time action and then you do nothing else. It's not quite that simple, but one-time action, you can get rid of this invasive species, and then the recovery can happen on its own, or you create opportunities for human-assisted recovery in a variety of ways. But you do sort of create a commitment to that island long-term in the sense of biosecurity. This is a major financial investment often, but also a major conservation investment to get this done. And so you want to protect that. And, biosecurity, meaning the prevention of, the species you removed from coming back, but also the prevention of other new species being introduced, which could easily happen when you're doing a project like this. We'd hate to bring a whole crew out to an island saying we're going to get rid of an invasive rat, for example, and bring a bunch of weed seeds in our boots, or leave with some other pest. So that's a big part of what we do. Yeah.
Good. That's good. All good. It's funny. All this talk about rats has me thinking about, I'm not sure if you're aware, you probably are. Alberta has I think we're one of the only places in the Northern Hemisphere that doesn't have rats, because we have a rat patrol, We literally have, we don't have rats in Alberta for some reason. Everywhere else has rats like totally surrounding us, like every state and the provinces, but we don't have rats because we have literally a rat patrol that just like is constantly just like trapping rats and murdering rats. It's just,
oh wow.
Let's get them to islands. Let's get them out there.
It's so weird. I learned about that. I remember seeing a map of it. It was just like a world map of everywhere where there's maps where there's rats. And it was like the whole northern hemisphere is covered except for like this little island of Alberta. And I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. Why is that the case? It's not like Alberta is like super highly populated. Like you go up north, there's next to nobody. But yeah, it's a weird thing. But anyways, that just kind of tied into the idea you were saying about the need for continual. You can't it is kind of a one-time thing to get started, but then you gotta upkeep, you gotta keep tabs because who knows? All it takes is one person or one crate of mangoes with a rat in it or something, right? And you're screwed. So no, it makes sense. So we've been talking about invasives as far as tying it into the ecology and restoring the ecology on these islands. And but can we talk a little bit about why that's important? Besides just, having the island be what it used to be, why is that important from other perspectives, like say, economically or culturally for the cultures that are on that island, or for like, climate reasons or whatever? Besides the idea of just having this, this pristine wilderness area or whatever, what's the importance of accomplishing these goals?
Yeah, so there are a lot of different benefits. And just quickly taking a step back, I recently worked with colleagues from Island Conservation and a bunch of other NGOs to write this paper on where have invasive species eradications occurred and how often has it been successful. And the reason why I'm saying this is because we found out that there was an 88% success rate that we could remove invasive species from islands. And
wow.
That's really high.
That's ridiculous.
It is ridiculously high. And, where there have been failures, which are incredibly important to track, we've learned from those mistakes and then gone back and been successful in some of these same areas. But so, the point was really to show like this is happening globally. In, almost 40 different countries worldwide. And one thing that we were able to pick up, or a couple of things we were able to pick up, is what was the history, like what were the island traits? So why were people doing these things? And so initially it was more of a biodiversity thing. We think, people on islands saw there was a problem. They started removing invasive species. And so over time, that effort kind of got more and more popular, more and more people started doing it sort of to prevent biodiversity loss. But, what we saw is that there's been sort of this change from doing eradications on sort of small uninhabited islands to larger islands, which have people on them. And also islands that are bigger tend to have more biodiversity. So you end up with more benefit. And, the reason for that is invasive species don't just cause harm to, other native species, but they also have, huge economic consequences, globally, not just islands. Total costs of invasives over the last few decades has exceeded $1 trillion. There's billions of dollars spent each year in North America to combat invasive species. I mean, it's no joke. It has impacts on tourism, economies, on agriculture. And so you think of islands and you think of the human communities that live on islands, and they are dependent on what they can grow on their land or what they can fish from the sea. And so, rats, they predate on seeds, so they have problems in agricultural systems, but they also carry diseases, as do cats. I actually co-authored a paper where we looked at where cats and rats were present. What kind of diseases did we see when they were absent? Okay. Did we see those diseases? So like leptospirosis, leprosy, or toxoplasmosis. Wow. And there was correlation of those invasive species being present and those diseases being present, inside these human communities. So there's this really important human component that is becoming more and more clear over time as we learn more and more about, what invasives are doing, but what happens when we remove them. So that, exactly. So it definitely goes beyond biodiversity for sure.
Yeah. And I assumed as much. That's why I asked the question.
Very good.
But leprosy and like diseases is something I never thought about. Cats. That's a weird one. Like I remember the first time I saw in Australia, apparently they have an invasive house cat problem, right? And there's like open season on house cats, and you'll see pictures of hunters with like 20 house cats laid out, and you're like, what fresh hell is this that we're looking at? And you realize that no, these people are doing a job, because they're causing havoc and killing native rare bird species and whatever else. And it's, what is a house pet one place might be a real problem somewhere else. And it's interesting to try and take your mind and realize those types of things, right? To try and remove that. Like I know in Alberta here, and that's just because this is my context is Alberta. That's why I keep coming back to here. We don't need to talk about Alberta, but I think about like we have feral horses, and people think that they're wild horses, right? They're like, oh yeah, we have wild horses. Like, no, wild horses went extinct here about 40,000 years ago and were reintroduced, and they're not. But because there's horse lovers, it's hard to convince people that we need to, catch them all and put them somewhere or whatever, right? Everyone's like, no, I love the wild horses. And I'm like, have you ever seen a stud pile? Literally like a pile of shit 3 feet high. Like that's not good for, for anything. Right. And, but my point is getting people to think about animals as not just, oh, it's a house cat or it's a horse or it's a whatever, to think about it as like, no, this is not supposed to be here. This is problematic. And it's not just rats. Like I think it's easy enough to say, hey, rats are a problem, let's kill them. You're like, yeah, okay, sure. Like absolutely. But like it's harder to convince people that you should eliminate all the house cats someplace, right? I imagine that's probably like, I can't even imagine the public information campaign that must have to go out to like get public approval to accomplish a goal like that.
Right. Yeah. And go ahead, Wes. Sorry.
Yeah. And I mean, it's, I would even maybe reframe it a bit is that, the way we approach these things is it's often a public collaboration because, these different projects, different issues, anytime, one group is making a value statement saying, we think we should prioritize, seabirds over rats or, the native species over the introduced species, that is a value statement. And so we have to recognize there's people with different values that is just as important to them. And so, it is a lot of work. And you're right. It does vary by location. It does vary by species. And it's not just about animals. One example, is on Palmyra Atoll, 1,000 miles south of Hawaii. There's a project happening now to remove coconut monoculture. So there, after eradication.
But I love coconuts. What's wrong with coconuts? Okay.
That's exactly right. Or some places you may rely on coconuts to live. Right.
Right.
Palmyra, there's some people based there for a research station it's owned by the Nature Conservancy and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service co-managed. And so there are people there all the time, but they're not there, making their livelihood. They weren't born and raised there. But after a rat eradication there, which Dena can talk to a little bit more about some of the recovery, but part of that was also where there was already coconut monoculture in the absence of rats, coconuts just grew in really, really thick. And seabirds and seabirds don't really utilize coconut palms that much because they're one straight up stalk with a bunch of, I don't know if you ever touched a coconut palm, but they can be quite pokey and spiky. They're not fluffy and soft like they might look. So I mean, that's obviously not really what the seabirds care about, but they don't use them as much. And so right now there's a big rainforest realignment project about halfway done of removing the coconut monoculture, bringing back the native forest, which we know will work because where there is native forest already, we saw really great results. And then that will bring back the seabirds, right? And but we take that to a populated island where there's coconut farming and it's relied on. It's a much more nuanced conversation about what is the value and what is, kind of back to that, what is invasive. And so it might really rely on working with the people who live there, the people that were going to be most affected. Maybe it's even an uninhabited island, but people visit it, for example. To figure out, what is the balance? What is the solution? So we can see the proven benefits. Maybe it's about, well, how much land is needed for the management and use of, coconut production as a food source, and how much is not, and how much could be used to reforest and bring back seabirds. And then the kind of tying that back to the human benefit of that is when seabirds come back to an island, they bring poop, and they poop, and that fertilizes the land, that fertilizes the plant, and these tropical islands tend to get a lot of rain. So that rain washes all these nutrients also into the nearshore environment, which effectively fertilizes those coral reefs, increases productivity there. So again, those people that are potentially relying on coconut as a food source are probably also relying on the reef as a food source. And so you can sort of hopefully come up with these win-win situations. But, back to sort of the original impetus, if we just come in and say, this is what's good, this is what's bad, this is what should be here, this is what shouldn't be here, you're not going to be welcomed, very, very well. The people that are living there aren't going to really want to work with you. And you might cause real harm. And you might fail to recognize the nuance that's there, and well, why is this valued? Why is this thing that we maybe say, hey, a biodiversity impact of X, we should quote unquote fix that? Well, maybe that's that is always just part of the story, and so that's why there's this need to really recognize that that the definition of invasive species and that why people might, have a certain value for certain things.
Totally.
Yeah, I think it's important that Wes just said this. It's important to emphasize that, eradications are not just done by one group of people. It is an incredibly collaborative effort that really comes from the people that live on that island first, gotcha. Recognizing their own values, their own needs, their own, need to survive and thrive. And typically that leads to needing to remove invasive species to improve ag, to improve the reefs. There's a fishing communities that live on islands off the coast of Mexico. Mexico actually has set amazing precedent for eradicating invasive species from islands. They've already eradicated, for all the islands that have invasives on them, they've already hit half of them. I mean, wow. It's really beyond what most countries have been able to do. But most of those islands are inhabited, and most of those projects, or not, if not all of those projects, were done by a local NGO, government agency, and the local community working together to make decisions to eradicate invasive species, and then also to implement the biosecurity protocols that Wes was saying. Once they put this effort into eradicating invasives, they want to keep them off. And so it's the community there that is paying attention, that's seeing, what's coming off of boats, what's coming in on our shoes. Let's stop that from happening because we've invested in our island. So it's just amazing, local interventions having this, huge global impact that we're seeing.
Absolutely. There's a huge parallel there to the forestry world in that, for a long time, forestry, at least in Canada, we've been kind of able to just kind of we know our business, and we talk to kind of some of the local people and make sure that all the values are set. But we kind of assume that we'll manage the forest this way because this is what's best for X, Y, and Z and everything else. And I think we're kind of at this turning point now where communication lines are wide open, and everything is everyone's seeing everything now, and forestry is kind of catching up to the concept of okay, maybe we're not the end all be all experts in this thing, right? Sure, we know how to grow trees, we know how to make sure the ecology is good from a higher standpoint, but we haven't been paying attention to the foraging plants of the indigenous people in the area, or we haven't been paying attention to the biking trails that's this community uses, or to the whatever, right? Maybe there's some specific type of plant that you don't know about that you're running over all the time and don't even realize it, right? And I think it's interesting to note that just in the environmental community in general, I feel like it's starting to open up a lot more to oh no, we're the people, we have the knowledge, we'll do the thing and just trust us, to more of, hey, this is what we would like to do. What are your value? It's the value thing again, right? Like you said, bringing in everyone's values, making sure that all values are being taken care of and all values are being considered in a real way. And so everyone feels like a contributor and they can take pride in what's going on. And it's interesting to see that that's kind of going on with the advent of the internet, right? We're starting to see just like this is all coming together, and we're starting to, instead of assuming we know what we need to do, we're actually having those conversations and really, really having that, like you said, public collaboration around like getting these things sorted out. So that's fascinating to see. I like that. That's very, very cool to see that these are common threads that we can pull through the environmental industry, whether it's invasive species on islands or forest management in the middle of Canada, right? That's cool. Very cool.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Dena.
Well, you were just reminding me of the stories off of Palmyra, just from a forestry perspective. I got into doing all this stuff because I loved animals, right? I wasn't really thinking about forests, but Palmyra is this amazing example. It's this atoll. It's 1,000 miles south of Hawaii. It's super remote, but people brought rats there, right? People brought coconuts there, coconut palms there. Well, what the rats were doing as omnivores is they were clearing out the understory from these islets. So you're having these mature Pisonia trees, which is like one of the main native trees. That's also where seabirds like to nest. Okay. These trees, there's older trees there, but all the seedlings were essentially gone. So before the eradication of invasive rats from Palmyra, our colleague Coral Wolf and her teams went out there and surveyed and said, there are no seedlings inside of our plots that we can find. Within a month of rats being removed, they already saw seedlings. I mean, there was a huge increase in seedlings inside these plots just so quickly. And it wasn't just that one tree. It was other native trees were responding as well. I had an opportunity to go back 5 years later with Coral and another team of people, and we revisited these plots. And those seedlings had turned into forests. I mean, It was absolutely incredible to revisit these places. I had seen photos, of like, oh, these seedlings were so excited about these little baby forests that are coming in. And just 5 years later, Pisonia in particular, had grown to being, literally just forests. And it was phenomenal how fast that happens. It's, tropical atolls, things happen fast. It's not the same as on our temperate environments, but yeah, I mean, we should be thinking about the whole system, about not just, I like to think about seabirds, sure, but seabirds need these Pisonia trees to breed, and they don't nest in coconut palms. So just seeing this sort of holistic perspective and how important these forests are for certain species, it just was an incredible story.
Yeah, it's cool to see that, like, we need people to be like, you need to have a specific expertise in one specific thing, but you also need to be having full discussions with everybody else along the way, because everyone's got a piece of this puzzle. And it's awesome. Love it. Yeah.
And I mean, that connection in the conservation community is huge. As we've said, I work for Island Conservation. Dena works for Pacific Rim Conservation, and the way the work on these islands connects, one thing I've been working on a lot over the last 5 years is leading Island Conservation's piece of the project to eradicate mice from Midway Atoll. So Midway's the second to last island in the Hawaiian island chain. It's 1,300 miles. Apologies for using the don't know kilometers, but way out from the main Hawaiian islands, there's this chain of just small. They used to be big islands, have eroded down, and out on Midway, it's the breeding ground for about 80% of the world's Laysan albatross population. So these aren't very big islands, but every year 400,000 pairs of Laysan albatross come to nest here. So, 1 million birds, and then they all have, one chick per pair, basically, and that's on top of, smaller burrowing seabirds that come in by the literal million, pairs, and nest, and we're working to restore this, but that's one piece, removing the invasive mice is one piece of the conservation story and protecting from invasive species. But Midway is connected to these places really far away. I mean, through the albatross. So albatross are well-known flyers. They'll, the albatross that nest on Hawaii can be seen on islands in the Aleutian chain, because they fly that far to forage. And it's also a great example to me, of connection between the conservation community, because Pacific Rim Conservation that Dena works for has done amazing work with the Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services that manages Midway as a wildlife refuge, collaborating with them to get eggs and chicks of these albatross species and taking them to the main Hawaiian islands, to higher places where they've built predator-proof fences, making islands within islands, eradicating the invasive species within them, and starting a new population. And to make the connection one step further, that I just think is really exciting, is there's also it's a smaller population, but black-footed albatross, another albatross species, nests out on Midway. And Pacific Rim Conservation those last few years has been working to take them. They historically were all the way on these islands in Mexico that these Mexican nonprofit organizations and the government has done so well in restoring, and they're starting new populations there. And that ties back to the canary in the coal mine element, because Midway is a low-lying atoll. It's very susceptible to sea level rise if it right. continues to happen. And so, we're doing our part to protect them now, to remove the mice that predate on the albatross. But others are working to make new higher refuges for these species so they can continue in the future. And so, we're working together. This is big and complex. And although we talk about, the value of this one conservation action, the amazing amount of opportunity that comes through collaboration and through building these connections to really amplify and leverage each other's work to, hopefully make a real tangible difference and protect these species for future generations.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been really fun working for Pacific Rim Conservation and still being able to work with Wes and others at Island Conservation. I mean, they set the scene for us, by eradicating invasive species from certain islands. They're creating places where, now we can go and make sure things are coming back. But Wes also mentioned predator-proof fencing, and that's something that is sort of the bread and butter of our work right now on the main Hawaiian Islands. So in the main Hawaiian Islands, they're we know them as being very populated. There are people there. With people come dogs, cats, mongoose, rats, mice, pigs, all the things. And we can't eradicate them from these islands. I mean, it's way too complicated, given, the tools we have and people's interests. And so we're not trying to do that. But we are putting up these predator-proof fences, which work incredibly well. And so, making these little islands within islands so that we can, bring birds from Midway to these higher elevation islands and create new colonies. But I was also going to say we're doing that as well on Kauai, where we're putting predator-proof fences on these in these montane, like really high elevation montane environments to protect threatened mules, shearwaters, and Hawaiian petrels. And the cool thing about this, and like connecting it back to sort of holistic conservation and forests and things, is by excluding invasive herbivores, excluding, rats, we're also helping the forest regenerate in those areas too. So we're hoping, even though our focus is like, let's prevent these seabirds from going extinct, let's create some new colonies that are safe from climate change, safe from predators, create resilient populations that maybe even a stepping stone to get them to other islands eventually in the future. But for now, we have to protect them where we can to ensure that they survive, this decade. It's happening so fast that we're losing everything. But, the secondary thing is that we're also helping, other things, not just seabirds. So it's fun across the board.
Absolutely. We've been talking a lot about the eradication of invasives. Can you guys break down, we don't maybe pick a couple examples that are common and just to give some people some perspective of how does one go about, what are the strategies you use to say to eradicate rats, right? I imagine rats are probably a pretty common problem, right? What's the strategy for eradicating rats? What's the strategy for eradicating mice? What are some of the common things that you end up doing that are just okay, we get to this new island, we're going to do this, this, and this because we know that's going to help?
Yeah. Well, it starts usually with asking a whole lot of questions.
Right.
We have the proven tools, as this paper talks about, the demonstrated success, but yet, each island is, incredibly unique. So we come in and we ask a lot of questions, and we usually do what we call a feasibility assessment. And so that's not just saying, is it technically feasible? Do we have the tools? It's saying, are there going to be ways to finance this? Do people who are involved and interested in the project want to see it happen?
Is there buy-in?
What are the, and what are the potential risks and side effects that we need to consider that might happen? What's going to happen when we remove the invasive species? Is there something else? These follow-on effects, all these sorts of things. So that's we ask that, and that generates a lot more questions, and we go through and sort of to fast forward through what usually takes a lot of time of doing legal compliance, fundraising, building these plans. That can take a lot of time. But for a rodent eradication, what we're really looking at is a set of what we call the principles of eradication, and that is do we have a tool that can we target every individual? Because when we talk eradication, we're talking getting rid of every single individual of the species that's there. Because if we don't, which we don't always, and we see that they recover very quickly, they're well suited to do that. That's part of why they're an invasive species. So can we target every individual? Can we manage the risks? Dena mentioned a little bit earlier, as we're getting into, more difficult, more complicated projects. Part of that is there's often more risks. There might be other species there that could be harmed by the methods if we don't do anything about it. So, there's planning of that. So it might be captive holding. Actually, a colleague of ours, Paula Castano, just led a paper focused on this specifically in the island eradication community. And they identified sort of 3 broad strategies for managing non-target risks and 17 specific tactics. Things like, when do you do the operation? Can you just take the animals away for a little while and hold them in captivity and take care of them there? Can you, do little different strategies to minimize the risk? So that's a big piece of, can this be done? And that is often a large part of the work. And then usually with rodents, you're using a specially formulated conservation product, a bait with a toxicant that is applied to all home ranges for the rodents at the chosen time and using the chosen strategies. And that's often done twice. And so over the period of maybe a month, 6 weeks, you are able to target and remove every single rat.
Wow.
And then all part of this is a lot of monitoring and measuring. I mean, these projects all have limited resources, but every one is an immense opportunity to learn, for the next thing we're looking at. So that's a big piece of it too, is measuring before and after, measuring what happens during the event.
I try not to have any, what's the word they use for military, collateral damage. And, accidentally killing something that you didn't intend to, get rid of. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I imagine that's a whole thing in and of itself of just like, okay, how do we make sure it's only the rats that go in here? I imagine that's,
I've been on a couple calls with Wes, Wes leading the charge for the Midway mouse eradication. This was a while ago now, but I don't know, Wes, it seems like you have like just all these spreadsheets of like, okay, well, what's the weather during what day and what month? And then how many of this bird is going to be here and what day and what month? And, what are our windows of opportunity, what not? So like I've seen Wes in action, just, planning it out meticulously and looking at, the window of opportunity. And if it closes, then you wait. It's kind of like the US is trying to go to the moon. We keep not sending our rocket up there because of, issues here or there. And it's better to wait and do it right than just go for it and do it wrong.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We talk a lot about, go, no go decisions, which you see in rockets and stuff. And it's like, we have, yes, these projects can build a lot of momentum, and we've invested a lot in them, but we have to remind ourselves, even down to that last day, we have to be ready to back off, and regroup. And I mean, I think we've all seen that the last several years with COVID, but that certainly happened on the Midway project. We were full on ready to go, and then the world shut down. And so, we've been working on it for the next few years and trying to take advantage, find the silver linings and take advantage of things where we can to do it better, to learn more, things like that.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, I can't imagine the logistics of trying to accomplish something like this. Like the number of inputs is just wild. I can appreciate that for sure. So, should we dive more specifically into the paper? Do you guys want to do that? You want to do that, Dena?
Of course.
So yeah, why don't we talk about this? I feel like we've got a good breakdown of kind of the possibilities and some of the strategies and that kind of thing. So this new paper that you did, maybe I'll just give the floor to you. You just go ahead and take it. What is it? What are some of the things you've learned? What is new has come out of it? And how do you take action on it?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, just to take a step back, the background of this was, a group of us, I was at UC Santa Cruz for a while, like I mentioned. So UCSC was involved, island conservation, folks in New Zealand, the invasive species specialist group, part of the IUCN, everyone recognizing that invasive species are an issue. People have been removing invasive species from islands for a while. So we wanted to just ask, real basic questions like, where have they been eradicated? How many times? What were the methods used and what were the outcomes? I mean, like pretty simple questions, but that information had not been consolidated before. So actually before my time, there was this database of island invasive species eradications, also another mouthful. So we call it the DICE, or our colleagues in the New Zealand, they call it the Dizzy. So whatever it is, call it what you want. It's this database that we put together. The
Australians, they're so silly.
God, just whoever, say what you want. Yeah. So, again, this before my time, there were folks asking this question and starting to kind of dive into like asking people at conferences, like, hey, have you done an eradication before? If so, where? Putting in a spreadsheet, just kind of nagging it at people for a while, getting some information. And, eventually I came in, my colleague, Dave Will, also at Island Conservation, Nick Holmes, who's now at the Nature Conservancy. We sort of built up this spreadsheet into this bigger database that I've mentioned, and did a very systematic effort of going through the literature, trying to figure out where these things have happened. But more importantly was actually reaching out formally to experts, because a lot of invasive species eradications and really conservation efforts in general, it's not necessarily published. Okay. Wes said this earlier, like there's limited funding in conservation. You can't do it all, unfortunately. So when someone, gets funding to do something, they usually get boots on the ground and they do it. And they're not spending the time writing up a paper for publication, which costs time and money. So a lot of knowledge is hidden in people's minds, or, in boxes. The invasive species eradications have been happening before the internet. So some of these are actually on paper. So reaching out to people and asking them these questions directly was a huge part of this effort. We talked to hundreds of people around the world asking these questions. And so ultimately, we're able to collate this information into a single place. And the data is actually available freely online, which is really, really nice. And it tracks this global contribution of invasive species eradications. And, what we found was there was over 100 years of this effort. So it's not new, eradicating invasive species from islands specifically. We also looked at vertebrates. So we weren't looking at, ant eradications or plant eradications in this instance. But, I hope that through these efforts, we really set the stage for how to do this for other taxa. Totally. But so for, 100 years of this activity, I mentioned before an 88% success rate, which is amazing. Really? Efforts, over 1,500 attempts on almost 1,000 different islands. Most targeted invasives were mammals, which we weren't surprised about, mostly rats. But there were also birds like the common myna, and some reptiles as well that had been targeted. And so the product itself is just really important for tracking these efforts. I mean, it's like you have to sometimes look back and see what works and what doesn't in order to plan for what you're going to do into the future. Gotcha. And it really highlights, the importance of failures and learning and reapplying what lessons learned to improve successes and eradicate invasive species from islands. And so, it just really showed this like mainstreaming of invasive species eradications from islands. I think one thing that was also interesting to me that came out of this paper is that saw that about 80% of all eradications were done by just 8 countries. Canada included. And New Zealand has always really been the leader in eradicating invasive species. They're an island nation. They have come up with a lot of the techniques that people around the world have used to eradicate invasives. And so that
I feel like they're one of the that's what I think about when I think of an island of invasive species. I think New Zealand. Like, it's just like, it seems like it's nothing but, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. We talked really about like culture of understanding, what's an invasive and what's not. Well, that, culturally there, people get it, and they are ambitious, and they know that they need to get rid of them. New Zealand does not have any native land mammals. Like, the only mammal that's native to New Zealand is a bat, because it can fly there on its own. But otherwise, nothing else was from there. And so, New Zealand, now that they've done a bunch of their smaller islands, they are like, let's predator free New Zealand 2050. Like that's what they're aiming for, which is so cool.
Okay. Yeah.
But what we saw was that, these 8 countries have done, it includes, the US, Canada, Mexico, Ecuador, New Zealand, Australia, and France. But more recently, in this last decade, more and more countries are taking up the implementation of these projects. It's not just these 8 groups anymore doing it. They sort of set the stage, created a lot of the methodologies, shown that it works, and now there's this amazing uptake elsewhere, targeting a diverse amount of different kinds of invasive species in different places.
Very, very cool. Yeah, so it's just kind of taking all the information and put it in a place. I never thought about the concept of it not being in literature and it being in boxes in people's homes or in people's minds, and not being able to, like, so just that action of like collecting that knowledge seems like a huge deal, right? And bringing that out into the open where it's available online. Like, so what kind of conclusions did you guys come to that helped you? What did this help you to do, this publication? How has it helped you so far?
Yeah, no, that's such a good question. I mean, it just came out. It's in scientific reports. So there's there's different avenues, right? Like there's different audiences. I mean, the main audience is for, people who want to do eradications, but maybe like they're afraid this is too novel. People aren't going to be accepting, or there isn't enough community acceptance of removing an invasive species. I know that there's some, like in Italy, one of our partners that wrote this paper, they're trying to eradicate some sheep in Italy off islands, and there was a lot of community disagreement about this. So he's using the results from this to say, like, hey, like, this is not a new thing. Sheep have been removed from islands since, the early 1900s, and here's what happens as a result. So, we've also worked on other research products that looked at what recoveries were. So Holly Jones wrote this amazing paper that was published in PNAS, showing that what happens after eradications and the incredible amount of recovery that's happened afterwards. So together, those important pieces of science, should be used to help inform decision making. And then on the other side of that, for me, kind of working on I'm collating this data. This is something that I've creating these databases, collating information, helping prioritize where we should go next is really the main thing I'm doing now at Pacific Rim Conservation. But instead of thinking about invasive species eradications, I'm thinking about seabird reintroduction efforts. So I've basically taken all the methods from what we did with this DICE and created a seabird restoration database. Seabird restoration database that is also now available online at seabirddatabase.org. And same idea. Went out, asked hundreds of experts, like, have you reintroduced seabirds into restoration sites? If so, where, when? How successful was it? And also, have invasive species been controlled in those sites? So it's literally building on the backs of what we know about eradications and taking it to the next step of restoration. So that's where it's being applied directly right now too.
That's huge. Just like having a place to go where you have all this information. Okay, what can we do? What works? Let's not spin our wheels on this now that we've got so much history and it's easy to access, right? And we'll make sure to throw whatever links that you guys want in here. We'll throw them in the show notes so people can access them easily enough. So just send me whatever links you want to throw in, and we'll toss them in there for people. So yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. Sorry, Wes, you wanted to say something here first. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, as I was not involved in the writing of the paper. I've used the DICE and the background data quite a bit in my job, but to compliment Dena, but also reinforce the importance of looking back. I mean, 1,500 projects plus is so many, but
it's ridiculous.
But in a lot of ways, for a lot of people, this is still kind of novel and niche. And so it's like, we really can't understate the ability as we go to people with big decision-making power and just to say, look, this works, and getting the feedback of like, yeah, this is, they see that it looks impressive. Dena mentioned early countries like Mexico, New Zealand have really great examples of sort of like established island strategies, but that's not the case everywhere. Even some of these countries that have done a lot of eradications, it's sort of project by project. And so to be able to take a summary like this and say like, look, this is something that works. This is something that we can think big, and we have the potential. We can look forward to 400,000 islands in the world. Many of them having invasive species, if not all, to some degree. It's like, this is worth investing in, and the power of having peer reviewed, peer supported. This is real. This is great news. We should use this. And so, that's really amazing, exciting piece of having this come out and sort of add to the body of this amazing science.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's not often you get this all to be in one place. Usually you gotta piece it together, right? And it's, this is very, very cool.
Exactly. And Wes just like, he hit it like that. That is why this is so important, is the job is not done. It's happened in a lot of places, about 1,000 islands, but we think about 80% of all archipelagos have rats on them. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done, and we have the tools to do quite a few of them. And we've put in work to figure out, where on islands are there threatened species at risk from invasives where we can work tomorrow. We have a list of that actually, published on another peer review paper that Nick Holmes led a couple of years back. And maybe that's not, the goal of some of these projects, but other ones, maybe it's that we want to restore ecosystem function for human communities. I mean, there can be lots of different values, lots of different goals, but the point is for a lot of these places, we have the tools to do this, and it still needs to get done.
It's proven, like you've proven that you can do this. This is not a like, well, if you can figure it out. It's like, no, we figured it out. Let's just do it. We need and there's more also to be done in the technology field. I mean, we can only do what we have the technology to be able to do. And that's a lot of islands, and we should focus on that for sure. But there's also innovation that still needs to happen and is happening. And arguably, New Zealand is leading the charge in doing that. Predator-proof fencing, we talked about, Pacific Rim uses it, not just them. We learned about it through New Zealand. So, they are developing other tools to be able to do eradications at much larger scales. And so we're kind of looking at that space and hoping that they are leading the charge on doing this. Yeah.
But others are too, of course.
Right. I can't help but think, I always think about when it comes to stuff like this, I feel like folks like the three of us tend to be kind of romantics in the sense that you're thinking about, like, you got into this because you love nature, one aspect of it or another, right? And that's the romantics in you. And the realist in me goes, what we need to do next is have like a complete economic impact statement of all of these studies and how this is like, I'm assuming skyrocketed the economy and stuff, because that's how you get the capitalist on board, right? Like, that's how all of a sudden the funding gates open. I feel like that's the next stage there. Hey, like, not nearly as fun of a study, but
yeah. And there recently, I think people are saying the same thing and saying, no, we really need to know what the costs are of invasions.
That's what it is. Yeah,
exactly. And we do actually. And so there's just been this huge analysis of where, invasive species are causing harm and, how much it costs. So that's been really an important driver of action.
It's always dollars and cents in the end. Even though it's boring, it's unfortunately that's how our world runs. Oh man. But no, it's incredible to see what you guys have been able to do, just to put all that stuff together. So I wanted to, you were talking about recovery and reintroduction and that kind of thing, right? So we talked about eradication. Can you paint a quick picture or give some example of maybe an extreme example, right, of where you managed to eradicate the invasive in question that's been causing the problems? You've done recovery and maybe started to reintroduce, and just, I want to kind of paint a picture of how that looks. I'm sure you have several examples you can draw from, Dena.
Yeah. So that's a great question. I was just going through my head because there are actually a lot of really good examples that I can speak to. Let me just start first with some of the projects that Pacific Rim Conservation is doing. And, in this case, it's not the full eradication of invasive species from islands. Like I said, we're using predator-proof fencing to keep them out. And what we did, and, we talked about this earlier, is we translocated 4 different species of seabirds from Midway Atoll to Oahu inside this predator-proof fence over the course of between 5 and 7 years. 2 species of albatross, a storm petrel, and bone-ins petrel. And it was we also set up a social attraction system. So seabirds are very colonial. They like to be around each other. And so they respond well to social cues. So we find that by putting these sound systems out onto islands or, into restoration sites or decoys. So for birds like albatross that like to nest right on the surface of land, we put fake albatross decoys like you would see for ducks, for duck hunting or whatever it is to lure them in. It's the same concept. So, using these social attraction systems, using this translocation effort, we've translocated many chicks and eggs. We rear them until they are big enough to fly off on their own. And then we cross our fingers and hope that when those birds are ready to come back and breed, that they come back to our restoration site. Seabirds have really interesting life history strategies where they spend between 2 and 8 years at sea, depending on if you're a small petrel or a large albatross. And then they go back to the place where they were born. So in this case, we've tried to trick them into thinking they were born in Oahu and not in Midway by translocating them when they're young. And we're seeing that they're starting to come back. So cool. we're getting our bone-ins petrels are starting to have been coming back now, visiting the site for years. They're starting to nest. They're starting to dig their own burrows. So we, when we translocate them, we use these artificial burrows that we put in the ground. Petrels are this unique kind of bird that they actually nest underground. They don't nest on the surface. So they need that kind of habitat. So we give them these artificial habitats to hang out in. Not only are they using those, nest boxes, artificial burrows, but they're also digging their own. So just in the course of, 5 to 7 years, we are seeing birds come back. And it's been incredible. We're also having our black-footed albatross start to return as well into these restoration sites. And the other thing that we've learned about, seabirds is we've talked about this. They eat fish and other things in the ocean. They come back to land, they poop. And that poop is so nutrient rich. And it's very important, especially on islands that are otherwise nutrient poor. Like, how do plants even get started without having nitrogen and phosphorus? Well, a lot of times it's from seabirds kind of helping get that started. So what we've seen is where there's seabirds, often you start to see these amazing changes in plant recoveries as well. We have another site on Oahu called Kaiana Point. It also has a predator-proof fence, and it already has a huge seabird colony that is there, shearwaters and albatross. And we have watched vegetation change over time and seen how that nutrient guano has changed that ecosystem into this amazing Hawaiian coastal ecosystem. So we're hoping to see that same change happen at our other restoration site in Oahu, where we've, been translocating birds. And so it's still a new project, but we're, taking data, we're looking at what changes over time. So not only are we monitoring seabirds, but we're also trying to see what kind of vegetation changes are we going to see. And so that's still in process, and it's been really fun to see those changes.
Absolutely.
I'd be, if I may, be happy to share a couple specific anecdotes that
Please
for
do.
me that really tell the individual island by island why this work is so incredible. And one of those is, you mentioned a little bit earlier the Song of the Dodo and some stories about the Galapagos, and on Pinzone Island. It's a smaller island in the Galapagos, but in 2012, rats were eradicated there. So the island still had pinzone tortoises, but all the pinzone tortoises were basically there because of really active management of collecting eggs, of taking them to the Galapagos National Park, incubating them, rearing them to a certain size when the rats wouldn't bother them, and letting them go. the year after rats were eradicated was the first recording of tortoise hatchlings emerging from burrows, eggs laid there, hatched there, coming out in 150 years.
Wow.
So, 1 year and this huge milestone happens. And, actually I'm a little mixed up because that incident, after that, a few years later, pin zone tortoises went from listed by the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, extinct in the wild, to vulnerable, and that's
so weird.
That's skipping past past the rankings of critically endangered and endangered to still we need to pay attention and protect these species, but to be kind of quote unquote only vulnerable through one conservation action is really, really incredible.
Absolutely.
And another anecdote that's more personal to me is I led a project on Cabritos Island in the Dominican Republic. So it's a island in a lake, so Lake Enriquillo in the Dominican Republic. So it's an island in a lake in an island, and it's home to two land iguana species. It's really special because there's many rock iguana species in the Caribbean, but they tend to be sort of island by island, and this is one of the places where two species actually overlap and live together. And when we were first working there, the iguanas were, the adults did okay on the island. They were fine. But it wasn't until the project was well underway and we started removing invasive species that we realized, hey, I'm seeing baby iguanas, and I'm just now realizing I haven't seen any baby iguanas before. Up until the point of I went back a little bit later, just doing my work, walking around the island and hearing things like falling from the trees, like little thump, 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 and not realizing what it was until I finally caught a glimpse of it. And it's, these iguanas, they emerge from their nest and they climb up in trees, and they're kind of arboreal until they get to be a certain size. And if they get scared, they just drop out and run. And it's like, to go of, these super endangered, super unique species. And because of the work we're doing there with not just us, but us and the governments and local nonprofits, and to see that's like, it's raining baby iguanas as I walk through this dry tropical forest, and they're just scurrying around, is just, if you talk about positive reinforcement for all the stress, all the work that goes into making this happen, I mean, there's nothing better.
Iguana rain. Yeah. Oh man, that's awesome. I should end it there, but I don't want to just yet. I did have one final question. Thinking about scaling this up to, I kind of want to just summarize and allow for people that maybe aren't in island stuff. There may be mainland like land managers or ecologists or conservationists. How do these lessons apply to mainland, right? Like obviously invasive species are there, a little bit different, but how should we be thinking about that? In your opinion, should there be a much higher focus, and should invasive species eradication be placed a little higher on the hierarchy of needs when it comes to environmental, recovery and especially in the age of climate change and trying to adapt to and mitigate, right? How important to you guys do you think that is? How much more focus should there be?
Yeah, I think that's an amazing question because, invasive species are a problem on the mainland. We should not ignore it at all. I think it's important to think about islands as not just islands, but insular systems. They have this geographic separation from water, but there's tons of areas like that on the mainland, like, mountaintops, for example. Those are insular systems. Some freshwater areas, like those are their own insular systems. So if you take kind of that island mentality, you can put it elsewhere, and you can think about, how can I take what we've learned from islands and do it here? Like, can we actually eradicate invasive species from these areas? Of course, you can't probably do it across of all of North America, but you can in select locations. Actually, Bernie Tershi, who's one of the founders of Island Conservation, he started another organization called Freshwater Life, where they're taking the fundamentals of eradicating invasive species from islands and looking at it for aquatic ecosystems. And it doesn't have to be on islands at all, obviously. So there's already these crossovers that are happening. I think, more and more people people are starting to learn about invasive species and their impacts, because there's been these economic analyses that have come out recently. And so it shouldn't be something that's ignored, and it can be something that's done. The idea of predator-proof fencing that we've done in Hawaii, that's been done in New Zealand and elsewhere, like that can be done on the mainland too. You can use that tool. And sure, it's not a forever solution, like eradicating rats from island can be a forever solution where they don't come back if you have good biosecurity.
Yeah.
Fencing only lasts as long as you can maintain it potentially. Yeah. But when you're talking about super sensitive areas that you need to protect for, all the different values that there are out there, people and biodiversity, restoring them now, creating resilience now is really the most important thing that we can do. So yeah, I hope and encourage people to think about it wherever they are.
Absolutely. Yeah, it seems like I don't hear a lot about it around like where I am, right? Like I don't really hear a lot about eradicating invasive species. It seems like a lot of times when something does take over, like I said earlier, we have Eurasian carp in Alberta that are a problem, right? And they've basically been released into the waterways, and they're essentially zombie fish that just like take over every egg hatchling they find and turn everything into, a clone of itself. And they're just like, it's just a weird situation, right? And there's people handling that. There's people trying to tackle it, but it's definitely there's not money being thrown at it. That's for sure, right? It's pretty small scale, and it's kind of doomed to fail, unfortunately, if it seems like. I know there's been a lot of success at kind of slowing down and protecting some of the endangered trout species because of that, but it still seems like there's not enough support, right? And hopefully a study like the one that you guys released, hopefully a publication like that can start to help conservationists in like pointing out like, no, like this is important and this is why, and we can do it. And it's hopefully we can start to get some more traction that way. Cause I feel like, the eradication of invasives on the mainland is definitely not a high focus, not a high priority. How would you, if you were speaking to someone who had the sway to kind of change the priority of this type of work on mainland places, it's kind of a weird question, but how would you go about convincing them? Like, what would you say? What kind of anecdote or what kind of example can you give that you think would maybe sway their attention a little bit more?
I think it's, a great thing about the island piece is that it gives that holistic, like it's done, yes. The threat is removed. And that I think is a challenge part of when we look at invasive species on larger landscape scales, or invasive species that have been impacting an environment for, more than our lifetimes. And it's just kind of normal. These island projects can be a reference point for what before and after can be, or what, the potential benefit can be. So I think that's a real point. But then I think also it's important to set real expectations that when we talk about managing invasive species on a much larger scale, that we do need new tools. And Dena talked about innovation. We need investment in that, and that sort of research and development of, what are the technologies on the horizon that can be coming? I mean, things like the use of drones, the use of artificial intelligence, the use of eDNA, which is, little bits of DNA in an environment to detect species at low populations. Things like that become really important when you're talking about removing an invasive species on a much larger landscape scale. And even things, should be explored, or at least ask ourselves the question of, what can be done and what should be done with, things like genetic modification, these things that can be transformative tools for invasive species management, that we don't currently have today, that can really take it to, when we talk about much, much larger areas.
Yeah, exactly. And, in addition, just talking about the money, I mean, in North America, alone over the last decade, invasive species have cost over $20 billion per year over this last decade. And that's up, from when these metrics were first, assessed. So, I mean, it costs a lot of money to control these things because they cause so much damage. I mean, and I'm sure, in forestry, you have what is it, the ash borer, right? That it's this
emerald ash borer. Yeah.
Yeah. That has, caused so much issue for native forests and forestry. It came in through, boxes with, I think it was like with wood from Asia or something like that. It was just,
that's right. Yeah. Something like that. Yeah.
So, I'm not an expert in the mainland invasives.
Nor am I.
I know a little bit. But anyway, the point is that, we are in a globalized world. We export, we import, we travel. And so, as individuals, we should be aware of those things,
Yes.
Where are you getting your stuff from? But more at a political level, there already are tons of rules in place to have biosecurity, to control agriculture, to control imported products, but it's not enough has been done. And we're seeing the economic consequences, and ultimately it trickles down to livelihood consequences. People can't do what they want to do anymore because they're losing the things that they've been working with. And so I think that that's another important, big driver that should help, inspire people to think about, where should I go? What should I do next? Well, maybe like talk to your, whoever is in your government, talk to your senator, speak to people who can make these changes to do a better job of controlling what comes into your area or what goes out.
Absolutely. Open your wallets, people. Come on.
Yeah.
Well, that was any final thoughts that you guys want to put out there before we end this? Because I think that was a great conversation. I really enjoyed speaking to both of you, but I don't want to leave anything left unsaid. So anything final thoughts that you want, or are we feeling happy?
Oh, I mean, there's, a lot more of the story that could be told, but, I really appreciate, and I think just, leaving it on, there's a lot of good work been done. There's a lot more to do, and we need to work together as individuals, as governments, as organizations to really have the maximum impact possible. But that impact is possible.
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are a lot of collaborations already in place, like trying to have these huge goals. I mean, we mentioned Predator-Free New Zealand. There's the Island Ocean Connections Challenge. I think there's another Micronesian challenge, inspiring governments and people to see the problem and do something. So, we're following that space and hoping that, these collaborations are really going to help move stuff forward.
Absolutely. Well, I think you guys have made a hell of a case, and it helps to break it down from the very simple to what is invasive species and down to how do we get funding for this stuff. It's great to cover the gamut, and I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot from you. So thank you for joining me. Thanks for your openness and your honesty and your willingness to share your experience and your passion. It's been great. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Invasive species. Something to think about, right? It's surprisingly something I haven't tackled before, so this is a perfect opportunity. Thanks to Wes and thanks to Dena for taking the time to do this, and to everybody at Island Conservation for helping set this up. And it was a great conversation. Really enjoyed it. And if you have any questions for myself, for Dena, for Wes, just shoot me an email, yourforestpodcast@gmail.com, and I will get back to you and answer your questions best I can, or pass it on to them for them to answer. So if you like this show, please rate and review it, share it on social media, get it out there. I'd appreciate it. It's free content after all, right? Just hook me up. Help a brother out. Appreciate it. Thank you. All right, folks. Catch you next time. Take it easy.